Welcome to 99 zu 1. Willkommen zu 99 zu 1. This is an English episode, and today we are hosting and are honored to host Omer Bartov, and I'll get him in right away. Welcome, Omer. Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, for everybody who doesn't know Omer Bartov, it's unlikely that somebody doesn't, but if you don't, then I'll give a short intro now. He's Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies for the Department of History at Brown University. He has written numerous books, too many to count, just a couple: Israel, Palestine, Lands and People, 2011. Then there was Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia and Present-Day Ukraine, 2007. A recent one, Genocide, the Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, 2018. This here is one of the more recent ones. I think it came out 2 years ago, just before October 7th. Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel, Palestine, a first-person history in times of crisis. I think you're also working on an upcoming book, at least supposed to be scheduled for next year. I think it's called Israel, What Went Wrong, correct?
Yeah, it's actually done. I'm waiting for the proofs in September, next month.
All right, good. Then we'll also follow up on this and maybe have you on again if we find the time with you. So Omer is among the world's leading Holocaust researchers and is considered a leading expert in genocide studies. He recently published an NYT piece called "Israel and Gaza: Is it a Genocide?" And in it, he says that it is. He's a genocide scholar. He knows it when he sees it, as one of the quotes. So he's concluding that currently what's happening in Gaza is constituting genocide. Furthermore, there was an interview in the German newspaper Zeit titled, I will read it in German. It says, "Ich bin für einen jüdischen Staat, aber gegen diesen." At least that's one of the quotes from the interview, and that made it to the title of the piece. It means I'm for a Jewish state, but against this one. This will also partly be discussed here. But let's get into the discussion about genocide in Gaza. Omer, maybe you can tell us a bit about your background, which is also very interesting, having grown up in Israel, served in the IDF, and how it shaped your approach of studying genocide and the Holocaust, maybe.
Sure. So I was born in a kibbutz in Israel in the mid-1950s, but I grew up in Tel Aviv. 1950s, 1960s, Israel was a very different place from what it is now. So I can say that I grew up in a country that still had all kind of remnants of socialism, had few remnants of what had been once a Palestinian civilization there. I was surrounded by destroyed or partly destroyed Palestinian villages in North Tel Aviv and Ramat Aviv. Also surrounded by Holocaust survivors. Many people had, come to Israel just before it was established or after its establishment who were survivors. So it was a mix, you can imagine. I served in the IDF for close to 4 years. Studied in Israel at the university and then at Oxford, and then came back and taught at the University of Tel Aviv until 1989, and then I moved to the United States. I would say, if you want to think about what sort of impact all of this had on me, of course, many. It's hard to boil it down to a single thing. I think I became increasingly aware of the Holocaust. You can imagine that when I was about 7, I used to hear just the reports on the radio of the Eichmann trial. I think many members of my generation sort of internalized these nightly radio reports of the proceedings for children who nothing much was explained to us. At the same time, we used to play as children in the ruins of villages, and nobody told us anything about that either. This subsequently, later on, when I was researching Galicia, you mentioned that book, it struck me seeing Ukrainian children playing in the ruins of Jewish cemeteries and synagogues. I started rethinking about my own childhood and thinking, what are the connections between all these remnants of civilizations that were erased and forgotten, and how does that affect the next generations? And then, in the army, I was the War of '73 was occurred about 8 months after I was, or 10 months after I became a soldier. That was quite a searing experience. Another experience that I'd worked my way through for quite a while was that I also served in the West Bank and in Gaza after the war, and began to form some understanding as a very young man that I was actually an occupier. And finally, just before I left Israel, which doesn't mean that I hadn't been there since. I've been there many, many times after '89, but began living in the United States with the First Intifada. And the First Intifada also had a pretty major effect on me. At the time, I was still liable to be called up for reserve service as an officer. Rabin at the time, as you recall, said that Israeli troops should break the arms and legs of Palestinian teenagers who were throwing rocks at soldiers, very well-armed soldiers. And I became increasingly disgusted with that, I must say. And again, I was lucky. I received a fellowship at Harvard, so I could leave. I didn't really want to go to jail, but I also did not want to be part of that. At the time, I wrote Rabin about it, and he actually responded to me, which was curious. I can talk about that, but I think he was also at that point gradually reaching the conclusion that the occupation was not feasible morally, ethically, politically, militarily. And he began making some moves gradually to change that reality. But of course, he was shot in '95. And that was probably, when I think about it now, one of the most successful assassinations in modern times, because it blocked any prospects of reversing that condition, whose final outcome we are watching right now. So that's as short as I can make it.
Yeah, thank you. So then maybe let's talk about the outcome that we're watching now. You write in your piece, I quote, "I know it when I see it." So obviously this is supposed to mean your conclusion on what's happening there. Can you please tell us, summarize your statement there and your analysis on what's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, I'll try to do it as briefly as I can. In November of 2023, I published an op-ed in the New York Times in which I said, I quoted many of the statements made by Israeli politicians and generals that clearly had a genocidal content. We're speaking about flattening Gaza, no water, no food. We're fighting human animals. There are no uninvolved people, and so forth. At the same time, and this is, of course, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th and the killing of about 800 Israeli civilians, most of them Jews, not all of them actually Jews. And at the time, those statements were, of course, frightening, but there was a tendency to say, well, these were people who were speaking out both in outrage, and also because of the fiasco of the Israeli military and government. At the time, too, the Israeli government and military were saying that the war goals, as they defined them, were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages, and 250 people were taken as hostages. And as a war goal, it seemed more or less reasonable to say that. So the question was, what was actually going on? Was it those statements that were made by various top figures, or the official war goals? And when I published that article about a month into, in early November, I wrote that by then it appeared to me that the IDF had already carried out war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity, because about 10,000 people had already died by then, most of them civilians. But that I was still not sure that this could be seen as genocide. But I warned in the article that it's better to warn about genocide before it happens than to lament it after it occurs. By May, I reached the conclusion that what the IDF was doing was actually implementing those statements, those genocidal statements, rather than carrying out the official war goals. And that what it was doing was systematically trying to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population. And the reason for that was that the IDF then wanted to move into Rafah, in the southernmost part of Gaza, in which there were by then 1 million Palestinians, half of the population of Gaza, most of whom had been displaced several times by the IDF, claiming that they had to leave their homes because those would become areas of operation. The IDF displaced those people and moved them to Al-Mawasi without any humanitarian infrastructure along the beach, and then moved into Rafah and destroyed it. And at that point, looking back at the pattern of operations, it appeared to me that the statements and the pattern of operations indicated an intent, and that intent was to destroy everything there was. And you could see destruction of homes, of public buildings, of universities, of schools, of mosques, of museums, of water plants, of parks, so that the population that was removed, so to speak, for its safety, would not be able to come back to those places because they would be ruined, and would never be able to reconstitute itself as a group, because everything else, educational institutions, and as we know now from the very detailed report by Physicians for Human Rights, the Israel branch, also deliberate destruction of the healthcare system, the entire health infrastructure in Gaza, and would also not be able to reconstitute itself as a cultural group because of the destruction of everything that contains a collective memory of a group, at least the structures and the collections.
Down to the registry of people, I think, even like the identity registers were destroyed, basically. Yeah.
Yes, archives, everything, everything. So that was the conclusion that I reached in May, and I wrote about it in August of 2024. Since then, of course, we've seen much more of the same. There were pauses which were forced upon Israel, especially the one in January 2025, in a ceasefire that was imposed on Israel by the United States, by the incoming president, Trump, and then that Israel broke in March unilaterally without any opposition from the United States. And as we see now, what is happening is an attempt to move the population to the south with the goal of removing it from Gaza. Now, I'll just say on the definition of genocide. So genocide is defined as actions taken with the intent to destroy a particular group, an ethnic or national, religious or racial group, and the Palestinians are at least 3 of these categories, if we leave out racial, in whole or in part as such. So what you have to show is both intent to do that and then implementation of that intent. It is possible, when you try to analyze it carefully, that policymakers in Israel, the cabinet and the military that serves as their arm, although now the military is kind of uncomfortable with the task it was set, that their goal is ethnic cleansing. What they want to do is to kick the Palestinians out of Gaza. And that's phase 1, because phase 2 is, of course, the West Bank, where there's creeping ethnic cleansing as well. But the population of Gaza has no place to go to. And so it's being moved from one place to another. And as that happens, it's being attacked. There's no safe zone that is safe, which is why we have a minimum of 63,000 killed, probably much higher, going up to over 100,000 just killed directly. And then there are many, many other forms of death and suffering and starvation. And so, as has happened in many genocides in the past, this operation that I think was envisioned as ethnic cleansing becomes genocidal. And that is what we are watching right now. And Israel, of course, is enjoying more or less total impunity up to this point in its actions.
What I was wondering there is if genocide may constitute also a means to achieve something else. Like, let's suppose that the actual goal is not extermination of a group, like total annihilation of a group, but really that ethnic cleansing part. But in order to achieve an ethnic cleansing operation of this magnitude, what you actually have to do is create such conditions and so much death and destruction that people are then, inclined to leave, and maybe even the international community would then, be inclined to see the worsening humanitarian situation and then implement the and what they don't call, voluntary immigration, or even sell that as a humanitarian activity. So could that then actually be genocide already when one attacks this group and tries to destroy this group in order to remove it?
So yes, you're right in the sense that according to the Genocide Convention, genocide is the attempt to destroy a group as such, in whole or in part. So what you're doing, you're trying to make it impossible for the group to exist as a group. The goal is not necessarily to kill everyone. The goal is for that group to disappear as a group. And there are various ways of doing that I elaborated in the definition. So one is killing members of the group. And, different interpretations of that conventions would say, well, what is in whole or in part? How large a part? And people will dispute that. And some people have said, well, 60, 70,000, 100,000 out of 2 million, that's not so big, which is a very strange argument morally and ethically. But one would say that in the genocide definition, this is only part one, killing members of the group. Another subsection is causing severe damage to members of the group, which could be killing them, maiming them, mentally, physically harming them. If you only think about what is happening with children in Gaza, even those who will survive, the kind of trauma, mental trauma that they've undergone, and the kind of lack of food and clean water, which will affect their growth, mental and physical, for the rest of their lives. So it's actually destroying or harming an entire generation. Then there is also creating conditions which make it impossible for that group to survive. And those conditions, as we see in Gaza, all you need to do is look at the aerial photographs and satellite imagery. The conditions that have been created in Gaza now, there are cities there that have been damaged more than Hiroshima. It's extraordinary, the amount of damage and the amount of explosives dropped on Gaza and the pollution of this place. And finally, in subsection 4, it speaks about preventing births in the group. And if you look now, especially the report by Physicians for Human Rights, you realize the miscarriages have gone up by 300% since October 7th. You will see that 20% of children are born either prematurely or underweight, and they have no medical facilities to help those children survive. You see that there is a tremendous crisis of orphans, a vast number of orphans, children who lost either both parents or one parent. Gaza also has the highest ratio per capita of children who have amputated limbs, often amputated without anesthesia, which itself is absolutely horrifying. So when you take all of these things together, whatever the goal is, even if the goal is to remove them from Gaza, the means that have been used are such that it appear to most scholars of genocide and most experts of international law to conform to the definition of genocide in the convention.
All right, this would be also my next question. You already hinted at it. Is Is this what you are explaining now? Is this consensus among experts like yourselves?
So look, I would say that as I wrote in the Times, I think there's a growing consensus among scholars of genocide and experts of international law. William Shabbos, who is one of the most highly respected experts of international law and a rather conservative expert, came to the conclusion in the course of 2024. Recently, he was asked about that, and he said it was absolutely genocide. I actually met him in June, and he was very strong in that. Another interesting case is Shmuel Lederman, who is an Israeli expert on genocide, and he's one of the authors of the now also very important statement that was issued by B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization made up of Jews and Palestinians, that also says clearly that what is happening in Gaza is genocide. And one has to imagine that for an Israeli scholar to say that, someone who's living there, is not an easy task. It takes much more courage than I need sitting here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There have been some historians of the Holocaust who have also defined what's happening in Gaza as genocide, such as Amos Goldberg, for instance.
Yeah, we're in touch with him too. Also, he will join
exactly
soon.
And Ras Segal and
Right.
and Daniel Blattman, but the majority have said nothing. The majority of Holocaust scholars, and all, to my knowledge, all the institutions, all the sort of museums dedicated to the Holocaust, to commemorating and researching the Holocaust, who all claim to speak about never again, have said nothing. And some have come out with statements claiming that those who call what's happening in Gaza genocide are anti-Semitic. And that's a very sad moment, I would say, because it undermines the very assertion of Holocaust studies, and I think a valid assertion that the Holocaust should have taught us universal lessons, not only about never again genocide of the Jews, but never again genocide, even if it is carried out by Jews.
So I would like to speak a little bit about this apparent rift between the different studies. I think most people might, or some people might not even be aware that there are different fields. So there's genocide studies and there's Holocaust studies, and Holocaust studies referring to the extermination of the Jews by Nazi Germany. The Jewish Holocaust. And what do you like? Obviously, you are speaking about this rift quite a bit. Can you explain a little bit to our audience how you explain this rift? Because normally one would think, okay, the judgments from looking at a genocide that is the Holocaust, which is also a genocide, should be similar. The outcomes should be similar. Why is there such a difference?
Yeah, it's. I'll try to speak about it as sort of briefly as I can.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
Yes, it's a big topic. Look, I mean, in the aftermath of World War II, there were, or even before the Holocaust ended, some scholars, some historians, and some individuals tried to begin to understand what happened and to collect information. And so there were attempts to write a historiography of the Holocaust. It didn't have a name yet. People didn't quite know what happened. They just knew that many Jews were killed, and many others, of course, millions of others who were not Jews who were murdered by the Nazis. And that was a very long process. And in the early decades after 1945, which is something that people don't really know anymore, the Holocaust did not feature as a major event in World War II, or a major event in the 20th century. It was something that Jews dealt with. It was an internal Jewish matter, and increasingly Germans, because obviously for Germans and for Jews it was an important issue. But in American historiography and in military writing, you could read books and look at the index, and Holocaust, Auschwitz, anything like that was not even in the index, was not even mentioned. That changed over the 1980s and 1990s, and the Holocaust became recognized as a major field of research, and more books, serious research was carried out. Now, simultaneously, but a little bit after that, genocide studies came into being. That in large part has to do with the fall of the Soviet Union, although there were some studies before, and the beginning of other genocides that were recognized as such, like in Bosnia and in Rwanda, in the mid-90s, following the fall of the Soviet Union. And you would have thought that, well, the Holocaust was a genocide, and there were other genocides, and therefore there should be no competition between the two. But that was created, and I would say, in part because in much of the historiography of the Holocaust, there was a tendency to speak about it as a unique event. So yes, it was a genocide, but no, it's not comparable to other genocides. It's unique. And unique, of course, it was for the Jews, and it was unique for the Germans. But in terms of the genocide, like all other genocides, it had unique aspects. It had the extermination camps. We don't have other genocides that had that. But of course, it had common features that made it a genocide, just like the genocide in Rwanda. But that created a kind of, I'd say, some kind of competition between the two, with increasing numbers of genocide scholars arguing that the predominance of Holocaust research and the growing weight of commemoration of the Holocaust, rather than teaching us universal lessons, was blocking people's understanding of other crimes that happened. Because if other genocides did not measure up to the Holocaust, was not as systematic, not as horrible as the Holocaust, then they didn't really deserve too much attention. And those happen to have happened, of course, not in Europe, but outside of Europe. So part of the discussion became, in the more extreme parts of it, that the focus on the Holocaust is actually diverting attention from the crimes of the West in the rest of the world. And that was a kind of implicit allegation against Holocaust scholarship. So all of this was in play, I would say, until October 7th. And I think that by and large, there was actually a coming together of both. Holocaust scholarship started thinking much more in a larger context, and genocide scholars were also accepting of the fact that the Holocaust was an important event and can be integrated into the general history of genocide. But October 7th shattered that because the Holocaust came to be seen as a kind of tool, a rhetorical tool, in both ways. In Israel and in other Jewish communities and defenders of Israel, the Hamas attack of October 7th was immediately declared to be the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And once you invoke the Holocaust, then you are in a completely different rhetorical plane, right? And Hamas started being described as Nazis, as they are still to this day on Israeli media, Hamas Nazis. That was one part of it. It was clearly an attempt to say, well, what Hamas did was like the Holocaust, or could have become the Holocaust, and therefore we have license to do whatever needs to be done, and we're not paying attention to anybody. We'll do what we can, period. On the other side, immediately after October 7th, and you will remember, there was an immediate argument that Israel was carrying out genocide, and that Israel, the country that was created after the Holocaust, was now carrying out its own Holocaust, which is one reason that not only I, but many other people who have some authority to speak about genocide hesitated and waited and didn't want to say on October 8th or October 10th or October 12th that Israel was carrying out genocide, because it hadn't started yet. And this created a rift. And that rift is a rift that is endangering both fields, but more importantly, outside of the academic sphere, it's also endangering a larger conversation in international law, in history, and in public consciousness of the need to prevent such events from happening, and the fear or the danger that the entire regime of international law that was put together after 1945 to prevent genocide, to prevent crimes against humanity and war crimes, is now crumbling because of the impunity that Israel is enjoying. And one has to add also because of the illegal war of Russia and Ukraine. These two events are really putting enormous stress on the system, which, if it disappears, would be a tragedy for everyone, because it will be replaced by great power politics and complete disregard to the smaller states in the world.
So what I find interesting about this, maybe just to shortly wrap this topic up, is that you are a scholar of both fields, right? So you are a scholar of genocide studies and Holocaust studies. So are you in this kind of conflict that obviously has risen in the last decades? Or let's say like this, how did you solve that conflict? Or is that even a conflict for you? Or was it never a problem for your studies?
Look, for me, it wasn't. But I have made interventions in that. There were moments in which people, unfortunately, erroneously, tried to put me in various categories, such as that I believe in the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and which I actually wrote against already a quarter of a century ago. So I made some interventions, but my view, I came to this very differently. I came to this from dealing with war crimes, not as a Holocaust scholar, but as a scholar of German history and of Germany's criminal war in the Soviet Union. And the myth that I was interested in chattering was the myth of the decency and cleanliness of the German Wehrmacht. And I then became interested in total war and the connection between total war and genocide. And I came to write about the Holocaust only after that. And so for me, writing about the Holocaust was writing about a very important event. And it was crucial to place it more centrally within the history of World War II and of the 20th century. But I saw it also through very different eyes, through the context in which it happened. So just for instance, the Holocaust would have looked entirely different, or we might not have even called it the Holocaust, had Nazi Germany not attacked the Soviet Union. It happens within the context of that war, and if you separate the two, you don't understand what happened. And I also increasingly started thinking about the connection between what happened to the Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, and what happened in Palestine in 1948. And I wrote about that because so many of the people who participated in 1948 or moved into Palestinian homes after the Nakba were people who had themselves been displaced, lost their homes, lost their families in the Holocaust. And that's not a matter of apologizing for one side or the other, but if you want to understand the kind of links between what was seen as completely separate historiographies. You can write about Israel-Palestine, you can write about Eastern Europe and the Holocaust, but they came together because people moved from one place to another, and these events were successive events. They happened right after the other. And so for me, this kind of ideological competition between Holocaust studies and genocide studies appeared to distract rather than help. And I have to say, my own title, right, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, is a contradiction in terms, because what does it mean, Holocaust and genocide? The Holocaust was a genocide. So in that sense, this tension is reflected even in the way we speak about these two fields. And I'm afraid that it's grown rather than diminished as it should have been.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I would like to also move on and discuss this Zeit article that was coming out here in Germany. And I mean, maybe I don't know how much you have been in contact with German media, especially after 7th of October. they are always quite peculiar about this. But what was striking to me, like there was something I noticed in that interview that they took with you. It was really striking that first and foremost, what concerned them about your judgment that there is a genocide happening was basically the existence and the continued existence of Israel. And what strikes me is that in when this is being discussed in Germany, maybe this is not so much the case in the US. You can maybe tell me if this is this case also somewhere else like this. There is really comparably little attention given to the future existence and security of Palestinians, let alone self-determination or something like this. So I see you basically making an argument for that there is a situation of genocide going on, and it's quite remarkable that for so many people, the first instinct is to say, yeah, but you are now starting to delegitimize Israel. So maybe, is this something that you have also noticed? Can you reflect on this if you've seen something like this? What this means actually?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, because you are in Berlin, right?
Yeah.
And I'll be there in October.
Oh, very good. So
yeah,
let's make sure to meet.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've given quite a few interviews on the German press and other social media, TV or whatever. And what strikes me always quite interesting, I must say, is that many, not all, but many German journalists, including very, very young ones, very aggressive in the way they speak with me. They fight back.
That interview was tough.
Yeah, they fight back, and if I say, well, there's apartheid in the West Bank, they say, are you sure is that not anti-Semitic to say that? And I say, no, there's a definition of apartheid and it fits what's happening in the West Bank. That's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. That's just identifying a fact. And it's interesting to me why that is the case. Clearly, there is, and it's not only the older generation, as you know, people of my age who actually were those in Germany who created, I think, a very impressive memorial culture and a coming to terms with the Nazi past. And they, of course, are committed to that in some way, and it's hard for them to let go of it. But also among younger generations that, at least in the media, appear to be very defensive, and speaking about what Israel is doing right now. So yes, I mean, I've experienced that. One has to understand, I think, and that there are such cases in the US too, of course, and we can talk about that. But there is a particular sensitivity in Germany, as there is in Israel, to say that Israel is engaged in genocide. It is not a small matter to say that. For Germans, obviously, because genocide for them, just like for most Israelis, means, first of all, the Holocaust. And to say that Israel, a country that was created in the wake of the Holocaust as an answer to the Holocaust, that was legitimized in the international community because of the Holocaust, as if finally the Jews will have a place of their own, all the nation stood by as the Jews were murdered, and now they'll have their own army and their own government, and they'll be able to protect themselves. To say that that state, 8 decades later, is itself engaged in genocide is unfathomable. It's simply, it's impossible to wrap your mind around it. Now, it's different for Germans than for Israelis, but the very impact of that is such that it's very hard to accept that. So I'd say, yes, there is an understandable difficulty to accept that. But on the other hand, I mean, you have to look at the fact, as I've tried, as soberly as you can, with as much detachment and logic as you can, and to say, is it or isn't it? What are the implications of that? Well, the implications of a country being engaged in genocide are significant. First of all, for the state as such, if Israel is found guilty of genocide by the ICJ, by the International Court of Justice, that has wide implications. And if the ICJ finds it guilty of genocide, and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, then identifies particular individuals in Israel as guilty not only as are already Netanyahu and Gallant charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also genocide, that has major implications on the future of that country. So you can understand that people have to be careful in making that judgment, and if they do, they have to realize what the implications are. And Germans, of course, know that very well, considering that Germany is still, in some ways, under the shadow of the Holocaust in its domestic and foreign policies.
Yeah, I agree. Coming back to this interview, there is one part where you say something, and of course this is it's a German interview, but I retranslated it into English basically. I want to read that real quick and maybe discuss this quote with you, because yeah, I have some trouble understanding that. So I can say for myself, I can say for myself that I'm pro-Zionist, but I want to be I want the kind of Zionism that now dominates in Israel to disappear. I am for a Jewish state, but against this one. Israel should become a different state, one that is not ruled by religious fanatics and racists, and one that does not treat its Arab citizens as second-class citizens. Now, from this quote, it seems to me like you're disconnecting what is happening, kind of what's happening in Gaza, this genocide, disconnecting, or at least posting it as like an accident, so it's not something that follows from the Zionist project in general, like the Jewish state in general. And I would kind of challenge that, because when you're talking about some, an ethno-nationalist project, like, I would say the term Jewish state already reaffirms that this is what this is about. Actually, what you will see is something like what we have been seeing in the last 70 to 80 years, and one potential outcome of this, maybe not something necessary, but are then also genocidal actions. So I think the history kind of shows that. So my question really is, what does that mean for you when you say, when you on the one hand say, yeah, okay, there's genocide happening, and that has a lot to do with how Israel is constituted and how it judges the situation, and at the same time you say, but you want a Jewish state. What does it mean to have a Jewish state if it's not people being a supremacy over other people? So do you think, or maybe to pose it a bit provocatively, do you think the current genocide is an accident, basically?
No, of course not. So we mentioned my forthcoming book, Israel, What Went Wrong? And the whole book is about that question. And the way I see it is that Zionism began in the in the 1880s as a movement of liberation, emancipation, appeal to humanitarianism by a minority group in Europe that was under growing pressure of nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism, and eventually more and more violence long before the Holocaust. And as such, it was like other minority movements that were seeking their own security and their own different future. When Zionism begins to settle in Palestine, also in the 1880s, and increasingly under the British mandate, it also becomes functionally a settler colonial movement, because it's taking over land, settling land. That's what he talks about. It says it explicitly. It's settling land, and because there are people living there, Palestinians are living there. This becomes a growing tension between the new settlers coming in and the people living there. And during the 1920s and 30s, Zionism has these two faces, because while the Jewish population in mandatory Palestine is growing substantially between World War I and World War II, and taking over more land and acquiring more power in Palestine, and thereby displacing more and more Palestinians, Jews in Europe are under growing threat. And that threat ends up in the genocide of the Jews. And so, in that sense, the community in Palestine is a safe haven for the Jews in Europe, and large numbers of Jews do come from Europe, and they're, because of that, are not killed, end up in Palestine. And at the same time, it's also a settler colonial movement that is taking over territory from the local population, from the indigenous population. In 1948, and I write about that in some length in the book, Israel is declared, and it faces a choice. The Declaration of the State of Israel, which is known as the Declaration of Independence, although it's not the official name, makes great promises about equality to all the people there, all religions, all races, all ethnicities, and so forth, and promises, that is in May 1948, and promises by October 1948 to issue a constitution that would be in the spirit of that declaration. And we're still waiting for that constitution. It never happened. So what I say is that Israel, as it was created, was faced with a choice. Would it say that Zionism accomplished its goal, among other things, by fire and sword, because it kicked out the majority of the Palestinians from what became the State of Israel and created the Jewish majority state? It could not do it with Jews from outside because most of them were murdered. So instead of getting Jews from Europe, it kicked the Palestinians out. But at that point, could the state have said, okay, we accomplished the goal of Zionism, let's put Zionism in the archive, give it a nice frame and so forth, and now create a normal state, create a state as it is that would be just, create a state that would even be able to handle the fact that we ethnically cleanse the population and try to create some mechanism of truth and reconciliation, some kind of restitution. But he didn't do that. And from that point on, Zionism changes and it becomes a state ideology, not a movement of liberation, but a state ideology. And as a state ideology, there are always moments at which things could have changed because history is not predetermined. But what we see happening is that it becomes increasingly ethnocentric, increasingly expansionist and militaristic, and increasingly racist. And that's a long process. And there are various, I mentioned Rabin earlier, because there are various moments at which it could have changed. And so, no, the genocide in Gaza is not an industrial accident, as some people said about the Holocaust in Germany right after the war. No, it's not industrial, but it was not inevitable either. It's one possibility of the kind of Zionism, the transformation of Zionism that has now become also a movement that is both about a Jewish state, right? A state for the Jews, and a Jewish state that is a state that is all Jewish. The goal of the people now, and the sort of coalition partners of Netanyahu, is actually to create a halachic state. They are not dissimilar from Hamas. They want the same thing as Hamas, but Jewish, without Palestinians, just as Hamas hypothetically wants to create an Islamic state with as few Jews as possible. Those people have nothing to do with the kind of visionaries of Zionism of the turn of the century. They're of a completely different quality. They've changed the very essence of Zionism. And, you know, I say in the article in the Times that I grew up in a Zionist home, and I dedicate my book to my father, who died in 2016, and I call him the last Zionist, because for him, for his brand of Zionism, Netanyahu was the greatest wrecker of Zionism in the history of Zionism. So in that sense, yes, it was not inevitable, but the writing has been on the wall for a long time.
I want to get back to this idea that you just elaborated off in 48, after 48, after the cleansing happened and a state was established, that there could have been a possibility to now say, okay, let's not make that our state ideology. Let's create a state that is just for all its people. And what I'm wondering is how this coincides, or how this can work together with the idea of having a Jewish state, not a state for the Jews. Because if you have a law, for example, that states all the Jews of the world can join our state, can come here, that's a safe haven for them, right? Which is, I mean, it's a understandable demand that we want this state to be able to take Jews in. You would immediately, if you want to reckon with what you said, like was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, you would have to reckon with that and then also take them back in. And you know, if not, you are already starting a treatment of inequality with the people that are connected to these folks that have been refugees, right? So the question really becomes, how could have Israel, you know, maintained a Jewish state? And I thought always that that really is what it was about. And at the same time be inclusive and equal to all its members. How would that have worked? And also, if you look at Rabin, I totally understand, and I also see it in history, reading the history about it, that he definitely had some changes of mind. But as far as I understand, even he was not ready to give up the idea that this should be basically a Jewish supremacist state, a state that is built for Jews and for Jews primarily, if not only, while at the same time, yes, having a minority that we treat equally, but it should still stay a minority. We cannot allow for the right of return, for example. And that immediately for me sounds like, okay, then this is not equal, correct?
Correct. Look, I mean, this is a complicated question. And of course, the law of return is a sort of fundamental concept for the state of Israel. And the law of return is an unjust law. As a law, it's only for Jews. So, and it's at the core of what that state believes in. That is, that it's a safe haven for Jews. That all Jews who want to come can come and become citizens. Now, it's obviously a very challenging concept, and the question is how do you deal with it? And I would say the following: I would say that the state of Israel, as it was formed in 1948, could have handled this very differently, and in fact, it partly created the model for that. Aaron Barak wrote a great deal about it, the Supreme Court Justice, about can it be Jewish and democratic? This is really at the core of the whole debate. Can you be a Jewish state and democratic state? And he meant Jewish state, ethnically Jewish, not Jewish in halachic terms, not that there would be rule by the Orthodox authorities, but ethnically Jewish. Over time, it's becoming more also religiously Jewish. That's reflecting trends in other places as well, of course, not to my liking, but, you know. And I would say this, look, in 1947, there was an option on the table for having two states. That didn't work out. And you can understand very well why both the Arab League and Palestinians living in mandatory Palestine said that that offer was unfair. And it was unfair. You can also say, I think, in retrospect, that it would have been much better to have taken it up rather than not. Simply because as we speak now, when more states now are recognizing a Palestinian state sovereignty is a very, very big deal in international relations. Whatever it is, however small the territory is, having state sovereignty puts you on a different playing field altogether. I believe that every group has a right of self-determination. What it does not have the right to do is to exercise this self-determination by oppressing others. That it cannot do. I think that Palestinians and Jews want two things. They want self-determination. The Jews got it, the Palestinians did not. and they want a right of return. Palestinians want it, and the Jews have a law like that, the state of Israel. If there were a Palestinian state, and I hope to God there will be one, it would want these two things. It would want, obviously, as a state, it would declare self-determination for Palestinians, however Palestinians define that, right? And it would want a right of return. It would insist on the fact that Palestinians who live now in Texas or in Canada could come and become Palestinian citizens. So in that sense, I think we are talking about ethno-nationalism. That ethno-nationalism exists also among, not all, of course, but I think many Palestinians, and exists in other countries as well. Germany, after all, changed its own laws only recently. As you know, Germany had a law from 1913, much of which was actually because of many Jews coming from Eastern Europe that defined ethnicity or defined German citizenship as based on heritage, on ancestry. Turkey has a law like that. So there are other countries that have that. The question is, do you exercise it in a way that enables you to oppress people, or do you exercise it in a way that nonetheless allows for fair and just treatment with dignity of your own citizens? And Israel does not do it also with its Palestinian citizens. It's passed the 2018 nation-state law, which shows that that state does not accept the idea of justice, the sort of idea that was in the Declaration of Independence. And the way to, I think, at the moment, the only way you could square the circle with Palestinians being in the state of Israel and Palestinians being in the occupied territories, with 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews on that area between the Jordan and the sea, you have to find a way that those two groups can share that space, because you cannot reverse history. You can't take it back. And just as genocide does not justify genocide, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948, which is well documented and known and included many atrocities, cannot be reversed as such. You can repair, but you can't reverse. And the only repair that can be for all of the horrors has to be one in which we find a way for these 14 million people to share that space, however they see right. If they want to have one state, then have one state. My sense is that most of them don't want it, but if they did, fine. I think that if there were, what I am supportive of, a confederation as elaborated in the A Land for All, that might eventually lead to one state. But whatever it is, we cannot reverse history, but we also cannot continue this history, which is only a history of more and more oppression, more and more violence, which is making no one happy. And one important element of this, and that's the other side of what's happening in Gaza now and in the West Bank, is that the state of Israel itself is rapidly changing before our eyes. It's becoming increasingly authoritarian. The rule of law for everyone, including for Jewish Israelis, is gradually unwrapping. And it is well on the way to becoming a full-blown apartheid state. And as such, it will become a pariah state. And it won't be able to exist for long as such. It'll become completely isolated from the rest of the world. Its allies will no longer be able to say, oh, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It hardly is now, and it'll become much more oppressive of its own people, of the Jewish population of the state. And so what we see now is the bitterest fruit of that, I would say, of that decision, which was made for pragmatic reasons in 1948, and had the seeds of what is happening now already sown them.
Okay, Omer, I have so many things that we could discuss and keep talking, but we're already in 1 hour,
Yes.
and so I will cut it short and leave let you be, because you have many other things to do. Thank you so much for being here. It was a great honor to have you. And really, if you are in Berlin in October, let's try to meet up. So with that, I'll leave it at that. Please, everybody, check out Omer's books and also his articles that we will link, of course, in this description down here. And Omer, hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.